everybody knows what trust is. Everybody knows how you can enhance it or erode it. And everybody knows that how you communicate is either going to enhance or erode that trust, right? And so part of that was creating this book. And I pitched my current book 3 years ago. It came out last year, right? So I kind of knew that I wanted to be having a different conversation, because then we can weave in these conversations, right? Now it's not necessarily race, gender, identity, but it's humanity, right? And that's something, if you're a manager, how do you get the most out of every single person on your team, right? And so trust, you don't have to have a cultural day for trust to still be relevant.
Welcome to the table. You're tuned into the Academic Boardroom with Dr. J and Dr. E. Pull up a chair. Higher learning, higher stakes.
Welcome back to the Academic Boardroom, where we sit down with power brokers shaping the future of education. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Joseph, and joining me is my colleague and partner in crime, Dr. Janice Gassam Asare. Today, we are pleased to welcome a very good friend of the show by the name of Minda Harts. Minda is a best-selling author, instructor at NYU, and a highly sought-after speaker who helps organizations fix trust and communication breakdowns so leaders and teams can unlock their full potential and capacity. As the creator of the 7 Trust Languages, Minda teaches companies how to build trust, improve collaboration, and drive high growth and performance in today's rapidly evolving workplace. She has worked with multiple Fortune 500 companies, global conferences, and top universities to equip leaders with the tools they need to succeed. Minda, welcome to the boardroom.
Happy to be here with you both. Thank you for the invite. It's like we're meeting for coffee somewhere in New York City. It feels good.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you on. So, just to give the listeners a little bit of background, you and I have been connected for a while. I think we first connected in 2019 to do an article about your first book, which was the memo. And so I've been so happy to see all the success of the memo and your subsequent books. And in 2020, I went to speak to your class at NYU. And we've collaborated in so many different ways for articles and for different things. And I've seen you at events over the years. So it's so great to just have you on. But for the listeners who are not familiar, could you share a little bit more about yourself and your background and how you started doing the work that you are doing today?
Yeah, it's funny to think about. I fell into this work, I'll be honest. I know there's a lot of people who are very intentional about their steps, but when I started this journey, I was in my 9 to 5 job. I was a consultant, and I was right? The only woman of color, the only Black woman, sometimes the only woman, period, the youngest, so I was sitting at all these different intersections. And I was the first in my family to graduate from college and enter into a corporate space. So I didn't know what I didn't know. It was the most money that anyone in my family had made at the time. So the advice that many of us get was work hard and keep your head down, right? Don't rock the boat. And so I was experiencing things, but I thought it was normal because I didn't have language for what I was experiencing, right? And at the time, I entered into a corporate space, in the early to mid 2000s. We weren't talking about race and gender. So it wasn't something that you could say, oh, I think this might be racism. You could never like say that out loud. And then you questioned yourself if it was that too. And so um, I suffered in silence for a long time. Over a decade in my job, like not really having the language. And then eventually, a very long story short, the experiences I was having started impacting my mental health. And I started getting panic attacks and a lot of anxiety. And I thought it was maybe me. I thought something was going on, like I'm the crazy one, right? It wasn't the environment. And the more I started to unpack things and name them, I realized that it wasn't me. It was the characters I was working with, the behaviors, right? The erosions of trust. And so I started this dinosaur thing called a blog. And it was every Monday I wrote a memo and I talked about those things that I was experiencing, but from a place of, here's how we can uh, have better conversations. Here's, I can't be the only one, right? So hopefully, and it turns out that I wasn't the only one. And so that those memos I had been writing for maybe 4 years ended up turning into something I had no idea would be my first book called The Memo. And so when I say I started that blog or newsletter out of a place of pain, and I didn't realize that my courage was tied to somebody else's freedom, including my own.
I love the story because I suffer in silence as well, but I use it, and I think you can also agree with me as well. But I tend to have a chip on my shoulder. I'm very motivated, and whenever something is bothering me, I can express how I feel, but I think it's best for me to actually put some work into it and or basically take my anger and place it somewhere else. My question to you is, have you ever felt like you have a chip on your shoulder, or you probably feel this every single day?
I don't know if I call it a chip, but I definitely would say that I think I kept forcing, the situation to work in my day job, and I was there for over almost 15 years, and I think some of us get advanced degrees, PhDs, if you will, in making everything work, right? And I think I was so like, "Oh, I have to prove to them that this isn't what it is, like, you don't have to treat me this way," like, trying to do more to receive half as much, right? And I think part of that was trying to convince, right? So it's like convince you that I'm supposed to be here, convince you that I'm good enough, right? Convince you that I'm top talent when I was never going to get that. And I think part of, I guess you'd say, my chip was trying to prove everybody wrong. I think sometimes as people of color, we just want to prove everybody wrong, like, and I think that started to kind of become bigger than actually healing myself and providing opportunities for others to say, you know what, we have choices. And I think sometimes we forget that we have choices. So I think part of that was also we not having like a space to talk about the chip, right? Or the experiences because you didn't want to seem like you were ungrateful, right? But I realized that two things can be true at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw a few years ago, it wasn't recently, but I've been, I keep up with what you're doing on social media and all the amazing work that you do. I saw that you're getting into script writing. Could you talk more about that? And I think you're in the perfect location for that, but how you kind of parlayed your background and your best-selling books into now writing scripts?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. It's funny. I always thought when I was younger that I would get into filmmaking, but I didn't have like a path there in my experience. I thought maybe I had to go to film school, all these different things, but I realized that I had been storytelling since I was in my youth, right, to some degree, and I wanted to be able to use my stories that I've written in the books and translate them into everyday experiences because let's be honest, not everybody's going to read our books, right? Not everybody's going to, that's just the way that people are. But there are other mediums that people do latch onto, and filmmaking is so powerful, right? So someone may never read the memo in their whole life and think it's not for them, but then they see the short film, the memo, and they're like, oh, wow, I didn't even, that hit a little bit harder, right? I see that in real time. And so I decided to start taking screenwriting classes back about 6 years ago because I was preparing for my next best thing, right? I think about this as building an empire. And if books is one piece of that, storytelling and film and TV is another. And so it's all part of once I realized that I can be intentional, I started to build in that way because I want us all to be able to have the conversations that sometimes we're afraid to have, even when they're hard.
As far as music though, because I'm into music as well. I do a lot of like soundtracks for this podcast. Do you also feel like music is also another medium that you can share how you think and how you feel to the audience?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And if anybody's read any of my books, music is a big theme,
I was
right?
gonna say you have, I know you have Spotify playlists for
Yeah.
your books, which I think is so cool.
Yeah, even fun fact, even when I'm doing my short films, I create a playlist for the actors for that time period. So if we're in the 90s, I put together a 90s playlist, right? Because I also want them to feel it cuz music hits different and you can express yourself in music in some ways that words just don't lend in the same way, right?
I love the immersion too, like the immersive experience that someone can, actually feel reading, seeing, listening to what you have to say or to the sound, to the sound of someone's voice as well. I want to also talk about, the process. I know it's not an easy process to write a book. It's not an easy process to write a script for a film. Um, as far as your thoughts and your mindset in terms of writing something, I want you to take us through in terms of your process, in terms of turning an idea into something tangible for the audience.
Well, that's a great question because I'll tell you, I am like a mad scientist. I don't know if that's how you all operate, but I get these ideas all day long and I just feel like, and so I'll send myself a voice note. Literally, for example, with the seven trust languages, I got that idea in 2020, but I didn't know what to do with that yet. And so I remember at 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard this voice say seven trust languages, and I immediately put it into my notes. And I would periodically come back to it and then write a little bit about it and then write a little bit more. And eventually I realized that that was going to be my fourth book, right? But I didn't know what those things were. And I started to think, oh, okay, well, I'm a big fan of the love languages. So if we have love languages for our platonic relationships, what are the languages inside the workplace? And I thought about all the things that were happening around the world. And even though I had been writing about women of color in the workplace for, several years, the undercurrent of all of those things was trust. And that allowed me to start to flesh out. And I'm like, okay, if I were to write a book, I call it my crossover album. Okay. If I were to write a crossover album where we bring everybody to the table, you may never know what it's like to be me, but you sure as heck know what it feels like when trust is present and when it's gone. And that's kind of how I do it. And then I storyboard and I started doing that before scripts. So I have these like big, gigantic, sticky notes on the wall, like the big ones. And I just kind of throw my ideas on it. And then I flesh out what stories do I want to tell about this and that and those sorts of things. And so for me, I write my books kind of like scripts, and so that really helped as I started to learn the craft of writing for feature films. And so it takes me a while. I'm not one of those people that sit down every day and write for like 2,000 words. I'm pretty much one of those people that once I have a download, then I can write 5,000 words in one sitting. That's kind of how my mind works.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your writing process and, did you do a lot of writing in school? And or is writing something that you've always kind of loved to do? How did you find yourself getting into writing? And yeah, I think the listeners may be curious about your path.
Yeah, well, I never thought I'd ever become an author, but I always loved writing. I still have notebooks from high school and college where I was just journaling and writing poetry. And one year when I was in college, I wrote a Christmas play for my church, right? So I've always been very creative in that way. And when I was younger, I used to write rap songs and record myself doing it. So I've always been a creative, but I'm an introvert, and a lot of people don't know that about me. And so a lot of it I never thought would ever be for public consumption, more so for myself. So when I had the opportunity to write for people to read, definitely was a vulnerable thing because now you're putting yourself out there in a way that I hadn't before. And so I've been writing ever since I could pick up a crayon.
What is your favorite body of work or your book or your film? What is a favorite project that you have worked on right now as of today?
As of today, I'm always going to say the memo because that opened up the door for what I'm able to do and how I can create. So that will always be my first child. Like, you have a special spot for your first, first child. But I will say one of my favorite works that is probably my young adult book because You Are More Than Magic, having an opportunity to write to the next generation, to write to the youth and say, you don't have to wait till you're our age to find your voice, right? You get to tap into that in the conversations with your guardians, your teachers, through your peers. And I just felt like that was such a special piece of work because I wish I would have had like a big sister type to pour into me that way. And so that was probably my favorite.
So I'm curious if someone wants to take the same path as your path, you talked about it in the memo, was a little bit unorthodox. You didn't plan to be doing the work that you're doing, but how can somebody who maybe looks to you as like this global corporate speaker and you've had these best-selling books and you're doing movies and things like that, what advice would you give someone who wants to take a similar path as you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think once I realized the power in my voice, right, that I took things a little more seriously. And I would say probably what really helped me is the consistency. Once I learned what medium I wanted to use, which was Twitter at the time and a weekly newsletter, I just religiously did that, right? I was still on my day job. I worked, 70 hours plus, but I would always make sure that memo was out on a Monday, right? Then a few years later, I created a podcast to kind of be as a supplemental piece to the other things. So I think it was consistency, and I'll be a forever advocate of saying, yes, social media is nice and the numbers are nice when you can have them, but I built all of these things and got my first deal without having those social media followers. So when you have a point of view, when you're really clear about what you want to say and you're not a fair weather kind of writer in terms of, oh, this is popular, I'm going to write about this. This is popular. So people never really know who you are and what you're about. And I think I put my fork in the ground early on and I was consistent in that. And when people needed a speaker or they wanted somebody's point of view, they knew who to come to. And I would encourage each and every one of us to continue to find that lane, right? Ava DuVernay says there's riches in the niches, and find what that is for yourself and stick to it so that people get used to who you are and the brand that you're trying to build. And I think that that's probably one thing that I see a lot of creators today. I don't think they're clear on what their voice is, and so therefore their audience doesn't really know what bucket to put them in at times.
Yeah, I'm so curious because I didn't know that you were introverted. I know you're an Aries and I'm an Aries, and I assume Aries are very like extroverted and outgoing, but I'm really curious to hear how you sharpen yourself as a speaker, especially as somebody who's more introverted. And I ask this because I got my mom into Toastmasters because it was something that I wanted to do to challenge myself to become a better speaker. And I suggested my mom tell a friend of hers and her daughter is maybe 18. And she went, and I think she wasn't really interested. And I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I had a resource like that at 18 that I could
Mhm.
take advantage of. But what do you do to sharpen yourself as a speaker and also as a writer? Because both of these play a big role in your career path now.
Yeah, absolutely. Once I realized that people wanted to hear from me, they wanted to, hear the stories in person, right? They wanted me to be the memory worker in front of them. I realized that if I'm going to do this job, then I have a responsibility to tell these stories and to engage, and I want to do that at the highest level that I can, right? And so for me it definitely was a struggle, and I took the Toastmaster classes, I did improv, and I did that even before I started to become the speaker that companies would call because I knew I'm always really big on, I guess that's part of like my type A is preparing, right? So I'm a big as preparing as much as I can. And so I saw what the future Minda needed in her toolkit. And so I started to invest in that before those calls even came. Even the last 2 years of my corporate experience, I started taking those classes and I would enroll anytime I saw a public speaking course, I would put myself into it. If we were in like a team meeting and it required role play, which I hated, I would put my hand up and do it because I knew this was important, right? And so even to this day, I still get butterflies right before getting on the stage or engaging with people because I am the person that would prefer to sit in the back and then but I kind of that's why I harness my Sasha Fierce. I get on the stage, do my thing, and then and come off it. But I think it's part of your legacy, right? And so I started to take myself out of it. Yes, Minda might be the introvert, but Minda, the professional speaker, the thought leader, this is what you need to do to continue to tap in with your audience so you stay relevant, but also you stay on the pulse of what the people want, right? And I think that one of the things I love about Rihanna, I think even though she hasn't had an album in many years, she still connects. She still taps in with the folks, right? She still does red carpet interviews. And I think that part of that is our duty as citizens who have a microphone to utilize that. And so I always keep that in the forefront.
Yeah, I'm really curious, I love the idea of the 7 trust languages. I think it's so creative and so unique, and it's definitely needed, and trust is something that I think is really broken right now in a lot of workplaces. But what do you say to organizations where a lot of these Gen Zers are coming in, they're kind of disillusioned because it's already really hard to get a job, AI and all of that. What do you say to, or how would you advise workplaces to ensure that they're instilling that trust in these new workers that are coming in that are even more bold and audacious than our generation, who are kind of like they're not putting up with any BS? What do you think should be done, or what have you think are is being done to make sure that you're instilling trust in, especially for that population of workers?
Absolutely. One of the things that I talk about when I go into companies is when people tend to say, I don't trust, excuse me, if I'm Gen Z, I might not trust a boomer or I might not trust a millennial, right? And so first we have to acknowledge that there's a generational trust gap, right? How one group communicates is not the same, right? Like I can safely say that we grew up in a time where you picked up the phone, right? You did have email, but you engaged a lot. And so millennials or Gen Z maybe slacking or DMing or texting. Digital format is more of their communication, right? Also with networking, we used to go to in-person happy hours, and a lot of this younger generation, they don't have that same experience. So it's an expectation gap, right? And so I have this expectation of you that you may not be aware of, or you might be, and it's vice versa. And so I talk to leaders and managers and say, it's not what you say, but how you say it, right? So if you constantly are saying in your meetings, you Gen Zs, you want a promotion in 30 days and you haven't done your work, and or on the flip side, we just need to push these boomers out because they can't learn as quickly as we need them to. What do you think that does to trust, right? Is there a better way to have the conversation when we are not meeting each other's expectations? And so I think it was really important for me to say, it's less of a trust issue and more of a communication crisis. So, but how you communicate will either enhance trust or erode trust. And that part people get, right? And so then people are like, oh, that makes sense because I have a team full of Gen Z and I have not been communicating, and therefore trust is being eroded, right? And so this is something we can solve for, and we all want that, right? Trust is a global language.
I was wondering, out of all of the companies that you have worked with, and you have a vast amount of companies that you work with in the past, what which company is your favorite company to collaborate with or to speak at? Which company is the best in terms of your culture and what they stand for?
I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of great companies, and I'll say all of them have been my favorite in some way, shape, or form. But one that I can say right now that I currently am enjoying is I'm working with McDonald's and with their global leaders or their global law, and so we're talking about trust. Like that's one of their values that they're moving forward, and it's been really great not to have just one-off conversations, but building out frameworks that work for their team that they can then disseminate to their direct reports. And so I love a company that's willing to invest in not just the one and done, right? But let's make these 7 trust languages part of our culture, part of our dialogue, part of our dialect. And so I've really enjoyed working with the team at McDonald's, in their law department specifically because their officers are tapping in, right? So it's not just your frontline workers that have to be the ones that get the trust, but it's also that trust is both ways, right? And so they get that. And so I've had a lot of fun this year working with them because, listen, there's no future of work without trust.
100%. And so I'm curious, you have experience working in academia, you're at NYU, and the memo was really powerful because not only was it your first book, but it really encapsulated this experience of being the only that a lot of people feel in their workplace. But for somebody who maybe is in academia and they're navigating a system where they're the only whatever, of their background or their particular community, what advice would you give? And I know the memo was more oriented to the workplace, but I feel like there are so many things in the memo that could also apply to, academic institutions. But what advice would you give to a student or somebody who's newly graduated, who's listening to this, who is finding it really difficult to navigate things as the only in their particular institution?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is sometimes when we're in these situations, we start to question our worth, we start to question our value, and we start to question if these things happen, therefore eroding our own personal trust, right? How many times have we second guessed ourselves knowing what the facts are? And so I would say to that person to start reading the memo because that's just that hug that we all need as a reminder that we're not making these things up, that these situations are taking place. And sometimes we don't have people in our life that are going to say it in a way that we need to hear it. And I feel like the memo really does a good job of having like a real conversation. And then the second thing I'd say, I'd actually encourage people to read Talk to Me Nice, the Seven Trust Languages for a Better Workplace, because what I didn't know when I wrote the memo those years ago was what I was really saying is, how do we communicate these things to people who have no idea or will never acknowledge some of the inequities that are taking place, right? But one thing I know to be true is when we figure out what we need from people, then we can articulate that, right? And that's part of self advocacy. And so the seven trust languages is saying if you don't get acknowledgement, how do you ask for that? Right? That's a language that you need. And again, they may not know what it feels like for you to be black or for you to be queer or you to be anything else. But what people do understand is when you tell them in the fact like, "Hey, I experienced this situation, you said X last week, it really helps me win," right? I'm thinking about how do I want this conversation to go at the end, right? Do I still wanna have harmony here? Do I want to enhance this relationship? And everything is down to communication, and I think sometimes what we need gets lost in translation. So we first need to start with that self trust. And then how do we communicate to that person what we need so that they have an expectation that is now we're closing that gap. So I think part of it too is understanding what you need from people, right? Because I think sometimes we're unclear about that and then we can have better conversations. So again, I think all of this definitely comes down to the communication piece.
Yeah, and I'm curious, and this is a selfish question. As a writer, what you do to sharpen your craft as a writer? Because I know we talked about your speaking skills, and I was really curious because I did not know you were an introvert, so that's like news to me. But what do you do? Because I'm sure there's people who I think people are either on one spectrum or the other. When I hear about them talk about writing, people will be like, I hate writing. I can't do it. I'm not good at writing. And then I think with AI, it's just like a whole nother can of worms, which I did want to ask you about as well. But what do you do? Like, what does Minda Harts do to better yourself as a writer and to improve and sharpen your writing skills?
Yeah, I read a lot. I think my number one thing that helps me is reading. I read books from the 80s, I read books from the 90s. I watch a lot of movies because I think part of it is, and one thing I've tried to do in all my books is even though they're sometimes hard topics or complicated situations, how do I make it digestible that you feel like this is practical and tangible for you to get off this call and move and make a step, right? So I feel like a lot of people can do the very high level writing, right? But how do you get it to where anybody in any industry understands what you're talking about, right? So for me, I like to read. Um, because it inspires me and encourages me, and I can also see how people are storytelling, even if it's a business book, right? Because I do read a lot of nonfiction, but I've started to also read more fiction because there's tools that writers use that we can also parlay. And then I also, at least or twice a year, I take a writing course. If it's a day course, online, in person, because again, times are changing. And like you said, with AI and all the different things, how we wrote over the last few years may change going forward, right? And I don't want to be like BlackBerry competing against Apple and I waited too late. Like I want to be in there. I want to be part of those changes, and I think that that's part of, I do believe you can teach an old dog new tricks, and so I'm always trying to figure out what that looks like for me. So, and I would encourage everybody not to get stuck. I see those wars on threads all the time. Well, I'm not going to do this, and we don't need this, and it's like, okay, yes, and right. Even if you never use these tools, you still need to know how they work. Right.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, like, does AI make you fearful at all as a writer? Because I know
That was my question.
one of the jobs that I feel like AI is taking, or one of the ways that people are utilizing AI a lot is to help them write things. I'm sure, and that's a whole nother can of worms. I'm sure you and Dr. Eli have seen it in your courses. I know I've seen it, and it's just like so many people are relying on. I went to a kid's birthday party, and she, I guess, used Chat GPT to write the her kid was sick, so she sent out a message basically saying the party's canceled. And at the end of it, it said something like, would you like a different response? And I was like, okay, this is Chat GPT. And I was like, oh, I know we all, do it, but does it
Yes.
worry you at all, especially as a writer, when so many people, I mean, ChatGPT and all these systems, they write well,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
does it scare you or worry you at all?
I think I was a little like apprehensive at first, right? Because I'm like, "Ooh, this last book may be the last book that I get to write in a traditional way, right?" And so I also had to be like honest with myself about what it looks like to be an author going to the next century, right? Or for the next decade. And at first I was concerned, and I had kind of told myself, "Oh, Talk to Me Nice will be the last traditional book you write because I don't know what it looks like for authors after this," right? And so I kind of had wrapped my head around that. But then um now I'm at the place of try not to use, even for like simple things where I think all of us use it sometimes to craft emails or make different switches, that it's not a go-to just to hit polish, right? Even if you wrote it. Because one thing I noticed even in the workplace is we start to outsource our humanity, right? And there's that nuance that we once had in our writing. Now we're just two agents going back and forth, and we're missing that, right? And so I'm really pushing myself to even the simplest things, not to use it, because I still want to be able to think critically. I still want to look at the nuance. I still want to, there's still a human on the other side of this interaction, right? And I recently was listening to, I know it might seem controversial, but Drake, he unloaded all these albums, and in one um song he says, you kind of sent me this really heartfelt thing, and then I realized chat wrote it, right? How people feel when they're engaging with you. And I think that's the part that I think we can use these tools, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think we cannot outsource our intellect, right? We can't outsource our humanity, and I think that's the part. And plagiarism, right? I think there's ways you can use these tools but still have original ideas, and I think that that's what I worry about, right? Because now I think a lot of writers are like, I don't have to have any original ideas anymore, and I think you still do, because but I say all that to say I still think there's a room for us, because chat isn't going to come up with those, at least right now, those original ideas. They're going to need us as a manager, right? To manage that conversation. So I think that's why it's important for us. If it's going to be a tool that we're using, then we should be the ones part of the makeup, part of in the room talking about how it should be used and how it shouldn't. So I do think there's still opportunity as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think chat doesn't have these creative, unique experiences that we have. So, I'm curious, Minda, you've accomplished so many really great things. And I know a lot of people look up to you and see you and say, she's amazing. If money wasn't an issue, would you be doing the work that you're doing today? And if not, what would you actually be doing? Like, what would an ideal life for you look like?
You know what? I can honestly say I'm doing what I love. Like every day I get to wake up and I'm helping someone, right? And I know that to be true because many of us have experienced as public speakers not having some of those opportunities as we once did as frequent, right? Because when the tides changed, so did income. So I know what it's like to go months without a speaking engagement and I'm still here, right? I'm still doing it. So I know when the money is low, I'm doing it. And when it's good, I'm doing it. So in that, I know that this is something that I feel so good because I think about our legacy, right? Like we're beneficiaries of so many people that came before us, and so many people are going to be beneficiaries of us, right? And when it's real, people know that. And so I just feel so humbled that I even get to do the work I do, that anybody cares what I have to say on any topic. And so that feels good.
I I'm thinking about when I think about like trust, and I wonder with technology and AI and some of the things that are happening in this world. Do you think people and companies pay more taxes on their trust onto other, whether they're outsourcing their humanity or their skills onto technology or to others? Do you think these companies have to pay more taxes on the front or on the back end?
Hmm. When you say tax, do you mean like our personal experience, like kind of like in terms of
No, trust tax, like
a trust tax?
yeah, like
Yeah, I do think, if I'm hearing you right, I think that there is a tax to be paid. And I think right now the people who are paying the tax are the employees, right? Because all the layoffs that are taking place, all the ambiguity, the lack of transparency, which is one of the seven trust languages, like we know that AI is here. We know that it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So don't pretend that people are stupid and they don't know what's going on. But what if we have better conversations? Yes, I know you're concerned about this tool. We don't have all the answers right now because it's moving so quickly, but we're committed to making sure you have the skill set that it's supplementing your work. It's an additional tool, right? But a lot of leaders are letting people fill in the blanks. And when we fill in the blanks on our own, then that's the tax that we're paying. And we're going to create this narrative that's going to be bigger than any like paradise episode and it's going to be pandemonium, right? And so I think that again, it doesn't have to be that. Yes, we don't layoffs are going to happen, reorgs are going to happen, but talk to people, communicate, right? And I think that unfortunately a lot of leaders are lacking the empathy around what it feels like and looks like to sit on that other side. I think a lot of people have forgot what it's like to sit on the other side of that table. And I think that just getting better communication skills. So unfortunately, I think the worker is paying the tax currently.
Yeah, and I'm imagining that, going back to your seven trust languages, that the trust becomes eroded when, I'm sure these HR people are using like Chat GPT to help them come up with a layoff script, right?
Right,
So
right.
like when it doesn't even feel, and you can read something and tell like this is Chat GPT wrote it. And so that also, I think things like that would definitely, if I'm an employee at a company and I'm like being laid off through an email and it's so impersonal and it feels like, or the person delivering the news feels like they're reading off an AI script. I feel like that's just so, it just feels so like you were talking about, it takes the humanity out of things. And so I think that that's something that we have to really think twice about because it's easy to turn to those things because it's just like, oh, I just wanted to proofread something for me. And it's like we're outsourcing, like you said, our humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important and we all are kind of fall like, victim to it, but I think we can change the way it is because if I worked at your company for 20 plus years, this like cold email that does it's very direct, I appreciate that, but just it's more than just having your commas and your colons in the right place, right? Like call me or say, "Hey, thank you for your time, served here." And then in the room when you have a manager who then pretends that I never existed, right? We're just moving on to the next thing. It's like, what do you think that does? Where's the trust lay for the rest of the people that are here? right? And when trust is present, we're 21% more productive. So our productivity is going to be very low when people are worried and anxious about, is this going to happen to me tomorrow, right? So trust is really good for business. So I think a lot of leaders need to like tap into that because it's not going to be good at the end of the day.
I have a question. Speaking of trust, we have shifted when it comes to DEI, and you have been a great champion for diversity, equity, and inclusion here. And since the new administration, they started rolling back, companies started rolling back, organizations started rolling back on their policies and initiatives. How were you able to pivot, and how were you able to amplify your voice despite the fact that, companies are making changes? And how are you able to also express that to the audience as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a heartbreaking experience, right? I mean, we were cooking with hot grease for a while. We were having a really good time and having great conversations. And then it just came to a halt. And um, I will say in the last year and a half, I can count on one hand how many times a company has called me to talk about the memo, you know? And and that saddens me, right? Because so many women of color, Black women in particular, have been impacted by all these changes, and so not being able to go in like I once did and have those conversations was is sad, right? But I started to forecast one of the things that I saw a few years ago that I thought would be coming down the pipeline was that how long does this portal last? Right? How long are people going to allow us to keep talking about these things? And so I thought, how can I stay true to my message but expand the table because something happened and people were like good with the conversation until they weren't, right? And that's what led me to trust because again, what I had been talking about all these years was about trust being eroded with one particular demographic. But I thought, okay, we need to expand the conversation, and everybody knows what trust is. Everybody knows how you can enhance it or erode it. And everybody knows that, you know, how you communicate is either going to enhance or erode that trust. Right. And so part of that was creating this book. And I pitched my current book 3 years ago and it came out last year, right? So I kind of knew that I wanted to be having a different conversation because then we can weave in these conversations, right? Now it's not necessarily race, gender, identity, but it's humanity, right? And that's something. If you're a manager, how do you get the most out of every single person on your team, right? And so trust, you don't have to have a cultural day for trust to still be relevant, right? So even in the book, I have a chapter about the history of the workplace and trust. And I can't talk about trust without talking about the slave trade, right? And who gets to trust and who doesn't, right? Who does trust come for automatically and who has to work 10 times harder to get it, right? Or why can't we just be trusting and just move on with Jim didn't mean any harm, right? There's a lot that goes into that. And so I felt like for my work to really be 10 times more impactful, I needed to be able to have the person who would never come to the memo or write within talks at their company, but they're going to listen when we're talking about trust, right? And so it was more of a strategic move in terms of trying to have a bigger, larger conversation. And lastly, I'll say, I realized that we through all that DEI work, many of us jumped in the deep end of the pool and expected people to swim in a conversation they weren't ready for. So I realized we have to go back to the basics, and you can't do anything without trust. So let's start with that foundational work.
I have an interesting, we're talking about that. I have an interesting idea, and this is a different conversation to have for the podcast. But I feel like certain agencies are actually being enslaved. I think ChatGPT AI is being enslaved. Because in a way that I
I'm
look at,
so curious what you mean
yeah,
by that.
yeah, in a way I look at
More.
it,
Tell
yeah, I I look at it as, in a way of, okay, do something for me. Do this. And we ran out of the humanitarian side of things. So if it's, hey, ChatGPT, I want you to do this for me. And it's not even and it'll spit out something. It takes me back, years from what I've seen in terms of, and I've never experienced slavery before, but from what I've seen of the people that were enslaved, it's basically, hey, do this at this particular time with little to no pay. And it seemed as though we were not human, right? Our forefathers or, our ancestors, they were not human as well. So when you were talking about, the humanitarian side and being able to build trust, I think we are enslaving AI. I really think we're doing that.
That's funny you say that because I saw something a few years ago when ChatGPT became really big that said, I always add please and thank you to my ChatGPT in case they realize that it said something like when they realize that we've enslaved them and that the machines start taking over, I want them to know that I was nice and I was polite. And so that reminds me of what you're saying, where, yeah, we do kind of treat it like this, like, yeah, like it's our, but I also don't think that it's like an animate object, so I think it's okay to do that. But I also worry and wonder, I'm of the belief that these machines at some point will take over if we give them too much power, like kind of like iRobot and that whole movie. I love that movie, and I do think that there's a lot of truth to that because I do think that they're what is the word when they're kind of like they develop feelings? There's a term for it, and it's escaping me, but it's like when the machines start to become sentient and they start to like feel things and get sad and get upset. And I don't know if either of you remember the movie Her, but I remember watching that over a decade ago, maybe in theaters. And I was like, this man falls in love with his like computer system. And I was like, that sounds like something that could actually happen. So I do think, not to go off in a whole tangent, but I do think that that is something that is possible.
The trust is going to expand and extend onto, and from humans to machine as well. We also have to trust, and the machines will also have to trust us humans as well. But I also wanted to, hear from Minda in terms of like how, in terms of the future, right? And how we should look into what's to come and forecast. And it's hard to forecast what's about to happen, but how are you looking into the future and how are you trying to plan and prepare for the future, Minda?
Yeah, that's a big question, but I will say we just have to keep learning, right? We have to keep sharpening our skills. We have to keep having these conversations. We can't just bury our heads in the sand and think that everything's going to take care of itself, right? And I think part of that is not being afraid of the future, right? I hear so many people like worry, 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 and we're never going to get the best of ourselves and what's to come and what role we have in it. Like right now everything is so early that we get to be part of the creation, right? Or we get to be on the front lines advocating for how it's used, what the guardrails are, right? And so we can sit back and be afraid, or we can jump into the arena and play a role. And so, because AI is evolving quicker than any of us even could wrap our heads around, but we get to be part of those conversations. So, I would just encourage all of us to just make sure that we're keeping tabs on Congress, right? And our local politicians and see what their stances are because in our local communities, that's what's really going to matter in terms of how, health wise and environmental things that take place with it. But I do think that it's important for us just to stay woke. I don't even know if you could say that anymore. But keep our eyes open to what's going on and not be afraid of it. Because I think communities of color in the past, we have been like last to drink from the trough, right? Because we didn't have as much access to know what was going on. But now we do have the access. And so let's not be late to the dinner party because of us. And I think that there's a lot still good things to come and we get to be part of that if we choose.
I'm curious as we wrap up if you have any exciting projects or anything that you're working on. Are you working on a fifth book? What do you have going on? Do you have anything that you want to share with us and with the listeners?
Yes, well, in the spirit of AI, I did partner with Google Labs, and they have this thing called the portraits, and so they've chosen a few different thought leaders who work with AI to build out. And so at some point, right, these platforms are going to scrape all of our work, and so I decided to be part of the creation of that. So if you're on Google Labs, go there, look at portraits, and I am your trust advisor, and so I helped build this trust coach there, and so you can put different scenarios and ask me for advice. So I just think that's kind of nice, because it's a little more realistic advice than maybe you might get from some of the other agents. And then I have my fourth short film coming out this summer called Demetrius, and I'm really excited about that. Just started to submit to all of the major festivals. And so, I hope, I don't know, but I hope that Talk to Me Nice will be the last book that I write in this way so that I can move into, more features and writing in that capacity. But maybe a novel will be in my future somewhere. But for now, I really want to focus on the filmmaking.
That's awesome. I was like, the last I heard, I listened too quick. I was like, the last book, but the last book of this nature. Yes,
Yes.
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Minda, we appreciate you for joining us at the boardroom. This was a delightful conversation, and I really thank you for it, taking the opportunity to hang out with us. It was a pleasure, and this is the Academic Boardroom. Dr. J, Minda, do you guys have any last thoughts, comments, concerns, questions?
Wow.
Thank
I
you. Thank you for having me.
I just appreciate you so much, Minda, because you're always down to. I think I asked you to write an endorsement for my book. You're always open and you're always helpful. You're always willing and giving of yourself to the community. So I appreciate you so much for that.
Thank you. I appreciate you both too. Thank you for valuing me and still seeing value, all these years. So I know our futures are bright.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Google her. She's a big deal. So, once again, this is the Academic Boardroom, and we're signing out right now.
Mind of a scholar and a business-minded soul. We at the Academic Boardroom, yeah, we keeping it 100. If you're looking for the truth, well, you finally found it. Take a seat at the head, let the dialogue flow. It's the Masterclass vibe. If you didn't, now you know.